My name is Scott Walker. I'm editor of the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal. The Fur Trade Journal is a publication of the Sublette County Historical Society and the Museum of the Mountain Man. And this is our 14th issue, 14th volume, and this is the first in a series of talks that come from the articles that are in this volume. And as you can tell from the title page, I'm going to be covering a full year and I have 30 minutes to do it, so I'm going to roll right into it. Philip Covington was born in 1803 in North Carolina. His family moved to Kentucky when he was 5. He grew up in Kentucky, and when he was a young man, he went to Ray County, Missouri. His half-brother had already moved to Ray County, and so Philip thought that he might have some job prospects out there. So he was a school teacher for a short time, and then he worked some farm work for his brother. And as he put it, there was no business doing and but very little money. In other words, there were not much prospects in this area at that time. And just about the time he was deciding whether to go back to Kentucky, William Sublette and the returning caravan from the 1827 Bear Lake Rendezvous turned up across the river from him and let it be known that he was looking for people to work for him as mule packers and trappers for a return trip to the mountains that would take place in that fall. And so in the fall of 1827, he signed on with William Sublette, and this was William Sublette of Smith, Jackson, and Sublette. This was 1827, and this was only the second year of that company's existence. And he agreed that he would take his chances of the rigors of the trail for a full year with Sublette and be paid $250 for that. They left in late October, early November, headed for the mountains, and the plan was Sublette would get these men up into the mountains, they would winter in the mountains, and then when the snow melted in the spring, he'd have a ready-made trapping brigade. When the spring trapping season was over, he'd collect them again, and they would continue to Bear Lake for the second Bear Lake Rendezvous of 1828. Now, 50 years after this experience, Covington was living in the Fort Collins, Greeley, Colorado area, and he realized that the people in that area at that time in Larimer County had no idea what it had been like to be on the frontier or past the frontier back 50 years earlier. So he started writing down his reminiscences. And those reminiscences were interesting enough that the Greeley paper, the Colorado Sun, picked up his story and published it over 14 issues between June and September of 1879. Now, the title he gave the story was 50 years ago, and he signed it PC, just his initials. It was a hit locally when it ran in the newspaper, and then it disappeared. When you think about the stories of time in the mountains, Philip Covington just doesn't show up in the list of trips to Rendezvous. So it had disappeared. A historian named John S. Gray out of Fort Collins was researching something entirely different in the 1980s. And he came across a reference in the Fort Collins paper of this series of articles in the Greeley paper back in 1879, and that got him curious. So he looked around and he located the only original existing copy of those newspaper articles, which is still in existence at the Greeley Museum there in Greeley. They still have it. They have the original. So he edited this work and he published it in Colorado Heritage magazine in 1982. And then the account disappeared again until Jim Hardy was looking for something else and came across a reference to John S. Gray's article. So he found John Gray's article and said, wow, why hasn't this gotten more attention? This is an important account of a period of the Rocky Mountain fur trade in the Rendezvous years that we don't know much about. So Jim published excerpts and a couple of articles in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and then it kind of disappeared again. So over probably 10 years, Jim and I talked about we have to get this out there and we have to get it better known. So this year, what we ended up doing, and this was our goal, is we went back to the original newspaper articles. We transcribed those articles word for word, and then we left Covington speaking in his own words. So that for the mere price of $25, you can get an important fur trade account verbatim the way it was written by the writer. Now, this account is not without problems. Either Philip Covington or his editor, I'll say, borrowed sections of this account as published in the Greeley newspaper from some of the well-known fur trade accounts that were in existence in the 1870s. As it turns out, when we worked through the actual transcript, it was easy to identify the borrowed or plagiarized sections, and then it left us with the Covington descriptions, which we could fact check against other references that we have of this period. I used to be a pilot, and we had a saying, never fly the A model of anything. There we go. This is a clipping from the actual paper. The people in Greeley are very helpful. If you don't live in that Greeley, Fort Collins area or can't get to their archive, you can pay them a nominal fee and they will get you a copy of the microfilm. And that's about the quality you'll see. Now, to back up a little bit and to set this account in historical perspective, William Sublette, Covington's employer, had a lot of travel in that year of 1827. Starting from the winter quarters up in the mountains, he and Black Harris traveled starting in January all the way back to St. Louis, arriving in the first week of March, in order to put the orders in with William Ashley for the trade goods for the 1827 Bear Lake Rendezvous. Then Sublette turned around and went out to Bear Lake with that caravan, stayed for the rendezvous, and then returned to Missouri, and then immediately started recruiting a return trip. Now, this is a very important point to this account, is some of the historians who have looked at this picture place William Sublette in the mountains along the Wind River during this winter of 27-28. And Covington's account clearly places him traveling back into the mountains during that period. This is one point about Covington's account that makes it important. It corrects the record. I'm going to make a shameless promotion here for alfredjacobmiller.com. Covington's account of a trip to the mountains so closely paralleled a trip from 10 years later that was documented by Alfred Jacob Miller that I was able to use Alfred Jacob Miller's illustrations to talk about what Covington experienced. This website, note it down if you have a notebook, it is great. A lot of high resolution images from Alfred Jacob Miller from some of the best museums in the world, and you can enlarge them, you can examine them, it's really great. So in one spot, you can see Miller's at the Jocelyn and the museum down in Tulsa, Gilcrease, and others that are just world class. And then also I'd encourage you, if you can, get out there and see these things in person, because there's nothing like getting your nose as close as the docent will let you to one of these originals. So once Covington signed on, he was outfitted for the mountains, and he talks about how he got a couple of heavy red shirts, stand back, and he got a good blanket coat, and he got a good rifle and plenty of ammunition, and he comments that it was a flintlock. And he talks about being prepared with equipment that Sublette was supplying for very reasonable prices, he said, which were put on his account. The first thing that Covington had to learn how to do was to become a mule packer. And it was 45 men in this caravan and 80 mules. So each man led a mule. And here you have a saddle mule and a pack mule in sketches by Albert Jacob Miller. Learning how to correctly pack a mule is not as easy. Well, I don't know if it sounds easy. It was not easy. And he described several blow-ups where basically the mule would kick off their load, they'd have to chase them around. I look at this Miller and I say, the little bit of time I've spent around horses, of course, if you have a horse blow up, what you need to do is wave your quirt around and chase after him yelling. That always helps. The first part of the account that Covington wrote describes the routine of the trail. You have to remember they're going up in the fall, so winter is progressing as they're going. So there's the routine of at the end of the day, you let the mules roll, and then you picket them. And you can see the people pounding pickets in the ground. Then you set up camp. The main difference between the caravan that Alfred Jacob Miller went with and the one Covington went on are the carts. There were no carts in the 1827 fall caravan. Meanwhile, while they were traveling, once they got into buffalo country, they had to put out hunters every day. And these hunters would range out from the main group, kill buffalo, take the prime cuts of meat and bring them back to camp. So it became a cycle. You had setting up camp, you had the hunters bringing in meat, you had eating on the prairie, and then the next morning, you'd have the call to catch up. And let's see if I can get this guy. This fellow right here is yelling, catch up your horses, catch up your mules. They had to go out, run out, get their individual animals, get them saddled up, and get on the way. So it came into a routine, day after day after day. The hunters, the camps, cooking, catching up, day after day. And Covington reflects this. And the way you get the sense of what prairie travel was, because we mainly concentrate on the exciting parts, was he made the comment several times during his year as they were traveling, nothing of particular interest took place. So I gave you that kind of collage of pictures to give you that idea. It was a routine, it was a routine, it was a routine over the 2 months it would take them to get into the mountains. One break in the routine was they got charged by a group of Pawnee warriors. And they scrambled to set their baggage in a fortification, get their animals in the middle and get ready to fight. But what it turned out to be was the Pawnee were saying, okay, you're scaring the buffalo and we're out here to hunt buffalo. We want you to go a couple of days south before you start heading west again. So William Sublette gave them some tobacco and the assurance that they would go 2 days south. And then as soon as the Pawnee were out of sight, they went 2 hours south and then headed west again. You got to remember, this is November getting into December. So the weather started to turn. The grass was poor, and the mules started to die. And so by the time they had lost about half their mules, Sabot decided, we can't keep going to the place that I originally wanted to winter. We'll winter on the North Platte River. And my best guess about where they wintered would be somewhere around Glen Rock, but that is just a guess on my part. So they wintered in a place where they had access to cottonwood bark, and Covington's description of how to, in the frozen winter, get cottonwood bark prepared to feed your mules, you could read that and do it today. It's one of the best descriptions of that process I've ever read. At the same time, Sublette sent a small party for trapping out to the Crow country on the Wind River Valley, and that's where the confusion comes about Sublette himself being in the Wind River area at that time. Because Ashley wrote a letter that talked about Sublette dispatching these people and they being under his direct command. Well, they were under his direct command, he just wasn't with them. Also, this was, as they set up their winter quarters, they got a Christmas ration. This really impressed Covington. He said, our most excellent captain gave each mess, and that'd be 5 to 8 people, a camp kettle full of brandy to celebrate. He said, we've had a hard time the last few weeks. We're settled in, we're ready to winter, have a good time. And that made him a most excellent captain. One of the people, you can probably name 24 mountain men that are well known. The one that should be better known that isn't known is named Vanderpool. And he was the person that Sabot put in charge of the group going to the Crow. And he was evidently quite the frontiersman, very capable. And when I went to try to cross-check his presence in the mountains, the main reference I found was in the Oregon Trail period of the first half of the 1840s, when someone traveling with Black Harris says, Harris found out that an old buddy of his, Vanderpool, is in the Oregon Trail group coming out this year, so we had to go to the camp so they could tell old stories. So someone as accomplished and famous as Black Harris recognized Vanderpool as an equal. When they had the spring thaw, I gotta go back one. I figured I could illustrate everything I needed to talk about with Alfred Jacob Miller, but when it came to digging a cache, this was the best I could find. The guys digging the cache are in the lower left-hand corner. You can barely see them. But anyway, there's a Miller illustrating digging a cache. So before they went trapping, they cached all their trade goods along the North Platte River, and then they departed up into the Laramie Mountains and trapped in there as the snow melted. And they trapped for the spring, and among the adventures they had, and this was one that really stood out to Covington, he had several bear stories, some of them were his own, was an incident that had figured around Johnson Gardner, who had, quote unquote, the best gun in the brigade, and it fired a 1-ounce ball, which means you're talking about the best rifle in the brigade firing about a 69 caliber ball, which is pretty good artillery. And just to keep it moving, buy a copy of the journal and you can read these events, but they chased around bears, bears chased them. At one point they thought that they'd lost some of their people who'd gone out to skin a bear, and then another bear showed up and they thought, oh no, they're bears out there chasing our buddies around. And so they went out to chase after the bear, and turned out to be 2 different bears that didn't know what the other was doing. And so they all ran around shooting. When the spring was complete and they needed to move on to Bear Lake, They raised their cache and found it was wet. And because Jim is a much better dramatic reader than me, I'll have him read the section about Covington bringing up part of the cache.
The next day was spent in opening and drying goods. Whole bales of calico had to be opened and spread out to dry. Then rolling and packing and baling again was a considerable job. One little incident, and I will close for the present. We had several boxes of raisins which had got wet, along with the tobacco. And as I did not eat tobacco, I indulged in eating considerable raisins, which were a great luxury at that time. The taste of the tobacco made me sick. And after a while, I was compelled to cast up all accounts, which was performed in as modest a style as the nature of the case would admit at the time. But it was a good joke for the boys to laugh at me, and they never failed to catch at anything that was of a funny nature and to carry it to extremes. Well, all our goods being dry and completely baled, we were then to take up the march for our summer rendezvous, which was away beyond the Green River at the Little Lake.
So once they raised the cache and dried the goods, they kept heading west. They crossed the North Platte River again at the Red Buttes, which, if you're familiar with the Casper area, that's Bessemer Bend, roughly. And then they followed the typical route up and over the Sweetwater to the Green. And when they got to the Green, they had been following a party of Indians who had hunted out the area, so they were pretty much starving. Their hunters swam the Green, which he describes as running booming full, while the rest of the party stayed on the near side of the Green. And the hunters came back and they found a couple of buffalo, and they had the hides and they had a little bit of meat, and they swam back across. And the caravan said, "Why didn't you bring more meat?" Well, there was a little bit of method to their madness. If you've been starving for a while and you eat too much, it'd make you violently sick. Could even kill you if it's bad enough. So they ate what they had. They made a bull boat out of the two hides. And Covington says that in that bull boat, the last load to cross the Green included 10 people. So that must have been 2 huge buffalo, or Covington's memory from 50 years ago missed the fact that there were more hides to it. But while I was looking around in the Millers, I bet you could count 10 people in there. So they arrived at Bear Lake, and this is not Bear Lake. This is just the closest Miller I could find. This is probably Fremont Lake, we think. But at any rate, they arrived at Bear Lake, and they set up a rendezvous ground near what's now Lake Town. And he gives a good description of the place that gives some extra clues as to where the rendezvous was. And that's a pretty clear map of it. As they were preparing for the trappers and Indians to come in to trade, they built a log cabin with a brush roof as a store. And he even describes making shelving in it to hold the goods. While he was there at Rendezvous, he evidently stayed relatively sober, and he could obviously read, so he was approached to be a clerk. And part of the spiel that they gave him to become a clerk was that, look over there to that young man, that's Robert Campbell, and he's making $1,000 a year. And the implication was, if you sign on as a clerk this year for $300 a year, and keep your nose clean, in a few years, you'll be up there like Robert Campbell. But Covington had a sweetheart back in Kentucky. And the way he sized it up was, he said, if I stay out here, I see so many mountaineers who never go home. And I'll end up falling in love with an Indian woman and living my whole rest of my life out here. And he basically says, no, I want to go home. So he turned down the offer, and they headed back to Missouri. Now, real quickly, one of the things that he describes was a scalp dance. This is actually a parade that Alfred Jacob Miller painted. And I highly recommend you read that in the journal. Sublette and his lieutenants bought horses and mules for the return trip because they had lost so many. And they started back. And as you might imagine, he quickly got into nothing of interest occurred mode. The one thing he did comment was on the food on the return trip. He said that he and the other greenhorns preferred to roast their meat, like you see on the left. The old-timers preferred to boil their meat for about 15 minutes just to, and this is a quote, kill the blood. And I looked up that phrase to see if there was a common cooking term in early 19th century America. And all I found was if you have just plucked a chicken and you want to rinse out the inside, some people talk about pouring boiling water through to kill the blood. That's all I could find. And one of the prime things that the old timers liked about boiling their meat was that it made a broth, which they call bouillon, or bouillon. And so they would look at the greenhorns and say, why are you not making bouillon? And they'd say, well, we like our meat roasted. And as he was returning, he realized that he'd gone through a change. He said that never had anyone seen such a nasty, dirty group of people. And he described some of their outfits pretty much in shreds. And eventually they arrived at General Ashley's farm near St. Louis, where Sublette paid off some debts that he had to Ashley. They gave each trapper or packer some walking around money, and they went into St. Louis, and Covington said he went in and he got a bath and he got a new suit, and he felt like a new man. And at first I thought, how long did he have to walk? But if you look at this map, it wasn't very far. I don't know if you can make it out there where it says Indian Mounds, you can see General Ashley's. What Covington had evidently planned all along was to take his earnings from the mountains, and he was very proud that he had as much money left over and hadn't run up much debt. He went back to Ray County, and he got a patent on the land. He said a nice little farm that's only, I think it was a half mile from the county seat. He was very proud of that. And then he said, the fine horse I left with my half-brother lent it out, and he got ruined. So he went out and bought the best horse he could afford, and he had cash money, and everyone else was cash poor. So he says, I bought a good farm and a great horse, and now I'm going to ride back to Kentucky and see if my sweetheart's still available. Which he did. He and Louisa turned up in the same place in Kentucky at the same time. She'd been out of town for a while. They both felt the same way about one another. They got married and moved back to Ray County, where they lived until 1875. At that time, some of their kids had moved to the Fort Collins area, and like so many grandparents do, they followed the kids and the grandkids, and they moved out to the Greeley, Fort Collins area. This is Philip Covington in later life. He was a Mason, and this photograph was at the Fort Collins Museum. So 50 years on, he started thinking back to what had it been like, and 50 years gave him quite a perspective. And so he wrote up the newspaper article, and they were run in the paper, disappeared, found again, disappeared, found again, and hopefully found for good now. By the time he died in 1886, he was a very respected member of the community. He was considered one of the old pioneers. And his wife had an article in the Fort Collins paper talking about how she had ordered chicken chicks, by train. And she wrote an article about how it was to order your chickens by train and raise them up and whether she turned a profit. And so the interesting thing about this obituary is, as best I can tell, most of it's wrong. It says he was born in Hannibal County, North Carolina. There is not now and never has been a Hannibal County, North Carolina. So I don't know where they got their information, how it got garbled. There's a trip to California he talks about being made in 1820, and I found no evidence of that trip. So I don't know if everyone was just gathering their Philip Covington stories and putting it in print or what. So what I hope you all will take away from this is the idea that we are reintroducing an important fur trade era account that has a complete year's cycle going out to the mountains and including some interesting adventures in the winter and with the trapping, the packing, bull boating, the time at the rendezvous and the return trip. And it also gives you a lot of really good insight into the business dealings between Smith, Jackson, and Sublette and William Ashley in the 1827-1828 period. Any questions?
Smith, the California project at that time when they went out there, I said the article didn't mention Smith. He was not at this.
He was not at the second Bear Lake rendezvous. He was out in California at that time. Oh, yes. The question was, Jedediah Smith did not appear in this account. And the reason was he was in California at the time of Covington's trip out and back. He was probably aware of him, but he wasn't anyone he met.
When he crossed the stream in 1827, and there were no, the game had been killed out by the Indians, did he mention the tribe?
You know, I can't remember right now. I don't think he did. It was interesting, and I talk about this in the article. Some of his language in referring to Indians are politically incorrect now, but they're very specific. So if an Indian kills someone in his party, it's a rascally Indian. That's a rascally Indian. If you're just meeting Indians on the prairie, he's an Indian. So what I found interesting, and the same thing with the word squaw, which is not a word that we use commonly today. But if I remember right, he uses the term 4 times squaw to refer to Indian women, which was common parlance at that time. And then at one point, he talks about how he's going to go back home to be among the white squaws. So he refers to Indian women 4 times and white women 1 time as squaws. So it's a different use of language. And again, when I study these accounts, I think something to keep in mind is when were they written and what was meant at the time by the language being used. You've got to judge people by their time period, not by our time period. And that's an important concept when you get into these journals.
Whether he actually trapped or was he a gamekeeper or?
He, as best I can tell, he definitely trapped. The question was whether he actually trapped. In that spring brigade, it sounds like he was one of the ones putting traps in the water. Because he makes it clear, and he borrows some things from a biography of Kit Carson at one point, describing the operation of trapping. But in general, it's clear he knows the operation and he thinks it's important to tell people of 1879 how it was done. So I think he really qualifies as a 1-year mountain man. So he saw the whole cycle, but he chose not to stay in the mountains. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You got back to Houston, he says we crossed the Missouri River again at St. Charles on a pretty good horse. He says this like
no, in this case, it would be something along the lines of a primitive barge or a barge of some sort that could carry a horse, probably roped across the river. A third, yeah. The horse boats you're thinking of, Jim wrote about a few years back, where he had a diagram of a horse actually turning the paddle wheels on a boat. I think you have the diagram. We talked about it. Any other questions? Okay. Clay is, you want me to? Yeah. Clay Landry is getting mic'd up and coming up to the stage. I always tell anyone who will listen that I owe a real debt to Clay because his early articles back in the 90s got me thinking in terms of the ledgers that are available to fur trading posts and fur trading business ventures, to look at them in a whole different way. That this is really specific insight into the Rendezvous era past and the material culture and the finances and how the companies interact. So today, Clay's going to talk to you about his article about a financial journal of Robert Campbell's trip to Rendezvous in Puresole in 1832.
You think that's funny? Well, good, great, thanks. That helped a bunch. Thanks, Scott. Thanks for the vote of confidence and giving people an idea of just how old I am. And I guess this is a year of bringing back stuff from the past that, because actually, if I tell the truth about it, I first heard about Robert Campbell's financial journal from the 1832 Rendezvous at a symposium here in Pinedale in 1992. A guy by the name of Dr. Ray Bruin presented it in a paper called What Money Tells Us. And I reference it in my article. Oops, sorry about that. And Dr. Bruin, he did not have a grasp on material culture or the history of the fur trade. He was just trying to expose the fur trade audience to an asset that was in the Mercantile Library in St. Louis. So I'd heard about this for many years. 1992 was a long time ago. And when we first got back into Robert Campbell with the video that Alan put together and stuff, and I found the original copies of the original journal from the Mercantile, then I got more interested in it because I had a background in it a little bit. So, Robert Campbell, interesting man. This is a picture of the original Campbell home. That's Alan McFarland. He did a video that's available for purchase in the museum store about Robert Campbell's entire life. It's got a bunch of interesting information in it, but I'm gonna fly through most of this fairly quick because again, what I'm setting the stage for is why this journal appeared. I mean, like Dr. Gowans always said, history doesn't happen in a vacuum, there's cause and effects. So what caused Robert Campbell to be at the 1832 Rendezvous with his own group of trade goods, keeping these meticulous records that we now have today? So what happened to get all this going? So we'll start with his birth in 1804 in Plumburg, Ireland, county of Tyrone, I guess that's how you would say it. At age 22, in 1822, at age 18, he followed his older brother Hugh to the United States. Hugh was in North Carolina. Robert Campbell's life in America started basically his working life with any record. Started in 1824 when he happened to get a job with John O'Fallon and James Keegan. Sure. Oh, we're streaming live? Do we charge them extra for that? Clip? So David, I've got some photographs in here that I use for supporting some of these topics that I think you took. So we'll see if you're awake when we get to them. I'll wake you up so you can see them. Okay. All right, let's get back to where we were here. So he's in the United States. He gets a job with a very famous merchant, John O'Fallon. And there's these O'Fallons and there's these Fallons. and you can chase your tail about this, but there's John O'Fallon, the merchant, there was Benjamin O'Fallon, the Indian agent, and then you're gonna see where Robert Campbell gets a tail twister, because he's dealing with a man named William, and middle initial O. Fallon. But in several cases, he refers to him as O'Fallon. I think he does that because of his familiarity with John O'Fallon back when he first started working in the fur trade. But that's where he gets his background in the fur trade, originally with John O'Fallon. Then in June of 1825, he became very sick, and the doctor told him, you've got consumptive condition, you need to go to Rocky Mountains. Is there a pointer here, Kurt? Oh, Clint? Yeah. Well, if I can handle a pointer and a thing and keep talking on topic, I'm gonna be doing good. It's still not working?
We just got to
Okay. Okay. Well, in the fall of 1825, you can see down here, in his own narrative of his life, Campbell says he signed off with the firm of Ashley and Smith to go out west of the Rocky Mountains based on the advice of his doctor. And at that time, Ashley was partners with Jedediah Smith in 1825. And he got a real taste of the mountain man stuff because they went to the mountains in October. He said fall, it was October. And another deal like Scott just described, they got snowbound in Kansas, all their mules started dying, they had to send back and get more mules, so it was an auspicious beginning for old Campbell, let me tell you. And eventually he became a clerk and a trapping party leader with his relationship with Sublette. He was both a clerk and a trapping party leader. So they must have thought a lot of Robert Campbell to turn him loose with the trapping party and still maintain the company books. So he got additional training in that bailiwick. David, do you recognize this picture?
Yeah.
It's it's east of Fort Bridger in that wonderful desert out there.
40 mile day,
No, that wasn't the 40-mile day. That was a day we almost died of thirst. In 1830, when we're in the Rendezvous, Smith, Jackson, and Sublette sells out to the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. But SDS learned from Ashley, so they became the sole supplier of Rendezvous goods and the fur broker for the newly formed Rocky Mountain Fur Company. So Campbell, he's come out of a job, and 1831 comes along, and SDS tries to go to Santa Fe and start a business, but Smith gets killed. Sublette decides to go back to St. Louis and continue providing goods for RMFC. Campbell had to go home for almost a year on family business. And when he comes back from Ireland, it's time for the 1832 rendezvous. And so in 1832, we just talked about the 1828. Well, here's a caravan that left Independence, Missouri on May 13th, 35 men and 300 head of stock, and that's not correct because I just read a letter that William Sublette wrote in May of 1832 to William Ashley that said he had 50 men with him. And that letter is in the museum and it's on display and it's a very interesting letter. But anyway, Robert Campbell, in his own narrative, he said, returning that spring to St. Louis, I again started for the Indian country, taking out with me a small outfit of goods, blankets, clothes, only 5 men and 15 horses. 10 of the horses were loaded with merchandise. So remember those numbers. 5 men that worked for him to pack and unpack, 15 head of horses, 5 of them for riding, 10 of them for packing. Because when we get into the journal, the financial journal where we have all the records, those numbers will match up with some of the items he's purchasing. So they hit Pierre's whole rendezvous on July 8th, which happens to be my birthday. That's one date in history I can always remember. The American Fur Company's 2 supply trains, one led by A.T.M. Provost and the other one by Lucian Fontenelle, they didn't make it past the Green River. So the American Fur Company had like 3 contingents of men. The largest one was led by William H. Vanderpool, and they were all in need of supplies. I can't talk about Puresole in 32 without mentioning that on the 18th, there was the largest, most significant fight between mountaineers and Indians. William Sublette was wounded, and 3 to 12, depending on the account, of trappers, and 9 to 50 Grovemont were killed. Now, Jim Hardy has done a great book about Puresole, and he's got in that book all the different accounts of this fight. So if you want to learn about that, you get Jim Hardy's book. It's also for sale in the museum's gift store. Sublette was wounded in that fight. So Robert Campbell, doing what he usually does, whenever there was a need, Campbell was one of these rare people that he would just step up and do it. And he didn't have a problem with being the leader or a subordinate. And I think that's what made him such a valuable person and helped him to a career that was pretty phenomenal. We'll get to that in the end. But anyway, he left Puresole in charge, leading the caravan, because Sublette was laid up. They arrived in Lexington, Missouri on the 21st and back in St. Louis by October. Sublette brokered the RMFC's 13,000 pounds of beaver fur for 58,000, of which he got a nice commission. So somewhere along the line, either when Campbell got back from Ireland in 31 or somewhere on this trip, they decided that they were going to pool their resources and form a partnership, which they did on December 10th, not long after they got back from the Rendezvous. And each partner would put in $3,000 of startup capital, and their goal was to challenge the American Fur Company for dominance in the upper Missouri River fur trade. They were going to build posts in wherever there was American Fur Company posts, they were going to build a post. But anyway, this need for capital is explained when we get into the Rendezvous Journal. I call it a financial journal. It's actually cataloged in the Mercantile Library in their archive. It's cataloged in the Campbell family papers as sale log, sales of goods to trappers at the 1832 Rendezvous. Believe me, it's much more than a sale log. Dr. Bourne, when he made his presentation, he called it an account book, which I think accurately describes it. But it's more of a financial journal because it's in consecutive order. He starts buying goods in March. He gets to the Rendezvous, all the sales records are there. Then he goes back to St. Louis and pays his bills. And collects his money. So it's a consecutive, it's in time sequential order. Anyway, its historical and commercial importance is really obvious. For one thing, it's a complete record. We know the merchants he bought the goods from, we know what he paid for them, there's itemizations of each, there's an account for each merchant with an itemization. And then we know who he sold everything to. There's itemization, there's an account for every person he sold the goods to, what they bought, what they paid. That allowed me to do a price analysis and see how much he charged these guys over what he paid for, and it allowed me to do a financial analysis and see if he made any money, and how much of the money he made was able to go towards that $3,000 in capital he needed with with Sublette to go after the American Fur Company. And it all dovetailed. It contains a variety of prices and sources and items traded to all the attendees that he dealt with. He didn't by means deal with everybody there, but some significant people. Campbell's portion of the partnership capital probably came from this venture, and a large part of it did. Here's some advertisements from the local papers in St. Louis at the time. This is an 1831 one. This guy, Tom Andrews, was a copper and tin manufacturer. You'll see his name on Campbell's list. This man here, Hill and McGonigal, they sell powder and cider and all kind of things. They were what they call wholesale merchants. You'll see McGonigal's name there, and you'll see some other people you might recognize. One of them is a man by the name of, where's Malaika? Thornton Grimsley. In his case, he's a saddle maker. He's a very famous saddle maker. He was provided most of the Spanish saddles for the trappers and especially the Smith, Jackson, Sublette folks. And I want you to notice this right here, because this goes throughout. This is original copy. There's a copy of the original ledger page for this merchant, Thornton Grimsley. He buys one Spanish saddle, Campbell buys one Spanish saddle for $10. But down here, he buys 5 more saddles, Spanish saddles, for $4.50 each. What were those 5 saddles for? The 5 guys he hired. Who's this $10 saddle for? Good old Robert. And so this is a very complete list. Down here, it's got 10 pack saddles. How many pack animals did he have? 10. So this stuff adds up. I mean, these are records that you never find. You find records of what was sold at Rendezvous. You find records of fur companies buying stuff from merchants in St. Louis, but you never marry the two. And that's why this record is so important. It's the whole record from start to finish. Here's the merchants, all the merchants that he dealt with. And remember, each one has a ledger. So if you go through that account book, you'll find a ledger in chronological order for each one of these guys. There's Hill and McGonigal, Lewis Newell with the blacksmith. I love this one. He didn't give this guy's name. He just called him Hornmaker. And they bought powder horns from him. And of course, the powder horn, there's one powder horn for $5 and the rest for $1.50. Well, we know who got the $5. And then Thornton Grimsley's bill was $124, and you just saw that ledger, and that's what it totaled. You know, powder, sock, the All brothers, they were Lexington, Missouri merchants, and they picked up just a few things on the way there. But remember this entry, Hawkins, which is spelled wrong with an I, that's the way Campbell spelled it, so I used it that way. Paid $30 for a set of pistols. Remember that, because we're going to get into these pistols towards the end. William Sublette, he bought $54, mostly was liquor. And there's an account towards the end of the book, right at the end of the book, there's an account with William Sublette that Campbell maintained. In other words, it's what he owed William Sublette. Because Campbell was not a heavy hitter like William Sublette when it came to Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri merchants. He didn't have a line of credit. He had William Sublette as his potential partner. So what he would do is he'd charge stuff against Sublette that he was using on this expedition. So as he charged something, he would put it down at his expense list, but he would also put it down as money he owed William Sublette. So there's 2 things going on there. He kept a list of expenses. He called it Expenses Attending the Mountain Equipment of R. Campbell, 1832. And he kept a list of expenses. Also, any of these merchants that he would pay for, he kept that there. So he had kind of a dual bookkeeping system going on. And I had to wade through both of those. So, because these pistols that he bought from Hawkins, and the Hawkins rifle makers at that time were Jacob and Samuel Hawkins, J&S. Anyway, the pistols he bought here, he borrowed that money from Sublette. So there was a $30 interest for pistols on Sublette's ledger and one on his expense ledger. So I had to kind of sort that stuff out to make sure I just got the items that he really needed on the expedition and only paid for them once. John James, if anybody knows who John James is, I'd like to find out. Evidently, he was a trapper, and from him, Campbell bought, 6 traps, a horse. I don't know why he decided he needed to buy that stuff. Evidently, he had an opportunity to make some money at the Rendezvous and bought it. There's 9 horses that he sold to American Fur Company, and we'll talk about a little bit more about them later. But he had 18 head in all that he bought, and they were all on his expense ledger and what he paid for them. So Rendezvous prices. Well, you have all this anecdotal information about how much they charged for items at Rendezvous. Let's face it, that's 1,500 miles from St. Louis where you can buy any kind of goodies. So what do you think they're going to do with prices when they get there? And all these guys need powder and shot and traps and trap springs and clothing, and they all need this stuff. You got a captive audience. It's better than the oil boom over there in North Dakota when they were selling all that stuff, selling Carhartts to guys for $200, So it's about the same thing. So here's what Bonneville said he witnessed at a Rendezvous as far as prices. And they were so absorbed in it, they became known as Rendezvous prices. And Campbell even refers to it as rendezvous prices in his journal. 1833, he said reported prices. $25 horse in St. Louis brought 120 in the mountains. $10 rifle brought 60. Basic staples like coffee, sugar, flour, pennies per pound brought $2 at 10 cups. And we'll show you some of those figures. John Kirk Townsend, he would have been at the 1834 rendezvous. He was just a not naturalist that was just along for the ride, but he wrote this: the principal liquor in use here is alcohol diluted with water. It is sold to the men at $3 a pint. Tobacco of very inferior quality, such as could be purchased in Philadelphia at 10 cents a pound, $2. There's no coin in circulation, and these articles are therefore paid for by the independent mountain men in beaver skins, buffalo robes, and those who are hired up to the companies have them charged to their wages. And that's just what Mr. Campbell did to those 5 guys that he hired. They needed stuff along the way. He would sell it to them at mountain prices, and then he charged it against the wages he was paying them. He paid them either $14 a day or a month or $15 a month. And I'll show you one settlement and how it worked out. It was pretty typical of how it worked out. Okay, so here's my spreadsheet of my study of rendezvous prices based on, over here is what Campbell paid for an item, over here is what he sold it for in Pierre's whole rendezvous, and over here is the percentage of markup. Now, how could he lose money at that level, right? But you want to remember, I spent quite a few years banking and trying to make enough money to ranch also, but the banking kept me in ranching, let's put it that way. And you know, that old saying, risk of, if you make an investment or you've got an investment in something, the risk should equal the reward. In other words, a high-risk enterprise ought to bring some good return. Think of the oil business when you think of high-risk enterprises. Myself, I think of cattle ranching because that's enough risk for me. But so this was a risky business. You could lose all your goods in a river crossing. You could get raided by Indians. There was no guarantee you were going to get to that rendezvous and sell all that stuff. And we'll see how lucky Campbell gets here in a minute. But anyway, you can see the alcohol was very popular, so they made sure they sold that at big money. The rest of this stuff is, you know, absorbing it, but not as good as that. And then down here, they get real reasonable on blankets and stuff like that comparatively to what some of this other stuff is. And then, you know, cloth and some of the red flannel and stuff is in the 100 to 300 range. And what it kind of looks like is the smaller items were the ones they like to really upcharge on. Combs and stuff, that's 700 and something%. Can't see it because it's blocked out. But down here, look at this, soap by the box. Can you believe that? We had a case of soap, shaving soap, that Campbell bought that he resold to the American Fur guys. And it was $75 in a case, and that's what it sold for. And here's the staples that they were talking about in those comments. Look at coffee. Look at flour. I mean, 100 pounds of flour for 3 cents a pound back in St. Louis, $1 for an 8 ounces of dry 8 ounces in a cup. Look at that. Sugar. And you know, those things were in demand. When you're eating buffalo meat and beaver meat, some of that stuff tastes pretty good. Down here in the traps, the things they needed to do business weren't that bad. But boy, these nice things are things they really would like to have that they don't usually get. They knew how to charge for them. But there again, guns, the big thing was lead. They really charged high for that. And the guns themselves weren't as high as what Bonneville tried to say they were. But anyway, that, you know, 700% for powder and powder horns is pretty decent return. But down here, this vermilion in the trade goods, down here, vermilion takes the cake because it's a small thing and you sell it by the ounce, so you can really upcharge it. 4,900%. Things like kettles, they bought them by the pound and sold them by the each. They could make a lot of money that way. But you want to remember, how are they getting paid? Well, they're supposed to be getting, nobody had any cash at Rendezvous. Like you said, it was all credit on the books. And so they, you know, they would get credits. They get $5, $4 a pound credit for beaver. Only Robert Campbell had a different twist on this, as you will see. So here's the guys they did business with. These are each one of these guys has a ledger. Each one of these people or entities has a ledger in his book. And it comes right after the ledgers for the merchants and right along with his expense account entries. So it's all right in order. And some of them had dates by their name in their ledgers and some did not. But you can see the majority of them, they got to the rendezvous on the 8th of July and left the 27th. So just about all these entries here are rendezvous purchases. But here's where I said that Campbell hit it lucky. Remember the opening statement where I said ATM, Provo, and Fontenelle didn't make it to the rendezvous with American Fur Company supplies? So look at here. He calls him O'Fallon. Remember I said his name was really Fallon, William Fallon. O'Fallon Vanderpool paid by draft on the American Fur Company on July 25th. They waited as long as they could. They waited almost to the end of the rendezvous for Provo or Fontenelle to show up, and they didn't make it. So they bought $3,491.50 worth of goods at rendezvous prices from old Campbell. And what did we say that he had outlay for the merchants? $1,511. That's pretty good gross margin just on that one customer. But this is what the total was, $4,325 for all of these. And up here we made little comments. This was paid for by a draft on Sublette, and you'll see, we'll get into these drafts. And this was paid for by Beaver. There's only two guys that paid for by Beaver. And this one, they were charging the counts, people that had a relationship with Rocky Mountain Fur, like Narcissa Provo, who was ATM Provo's wife, pro-wife. He had a St. Louis wife also. I guess the mountain men and these guys respected ATM so much that if his country wife wanted something, they let her charge it. So she charged her purchases to Rocky Mountain Fur, and her husband worked with American Fur, and I ain't figured that out yet. But anyway, that's what they did. They would like Madame Pierre had her husband worked for Grips and Fontenelle. She charged her stuff to them, and Fontenelle and Grips, they paid by draft just like these guys did. I've got a narrative on each one of these. I'm not going to go into all of them. It's just going to take up time. But I tried to identify who these customers were. Whether I couldn't, I think he was an employee with Alfred Stevens. And they both worked at one time for Grant and Blackwell. And they were the Battle of Puresole. And he's part of a story that's in one of the other journal articles from 2018 called Moore and Foy. It's about the bones of Moore and Foy. And anyway, John Gray, Fontenelle and Grips. Now, I wanted to talk right here this Fontenelle Vanderburg. It's actually William H. Vanderburg. And he entered a trade with Manuel Lisa in 1818. He worked for Missouri Fur from 21 to 28. And in 1829, he was leading brigades into the Rocky Mountains for the American Fur Company. So he was no rookie. He'd been around a long time. William O'Fallon, on the other hand, was an independent trader. He occasionally worked with the American Fur Company. Why Campbell included his name as a recipient of the goods that he sold to American Fur is a mystery to me, other than the fact that at the bottom of all these lists, it's a 5-page list of the goods he sold. This is what the first page looks like. I'm not going to try to read this to you because I did a transcription from it. And this is what it says. Invoice of goods sold O'Fallon, Vanderburg, by Robert Campbell on the Teton Firth, Columbia River under the 3 Teton Mountains, July 25th, 1832. So he made this is the 5th page. This is the 4th page of 5 pages. The original I showed you was the first. So there's 5 pages of goods. You can see on the 4th page it already totals 3,457. The reason I use this page is I wanted to show you this right here. 1 pair of pistols and holsters for $40. one pair, okay? Where did he buy pistols? Hawkins. So do we have something interesting here? We're always trying to document Hawkins rifles when they were used in the fur trade, how early. Now we have Hawkins pistols at the 1830 Rendezvous, I think. We'll get into that a little more later. The other thing I wanted to point out was, look at here, shearing tools and flinching hammers, that kind of stuff. Yeah, their horses were shod. We get into these, my AMN buddies and I, every so often, as we get new members in, we have to keep fighting these same battles. One of them's on roller buckles. They like to say roller buckles weren't period correct. Roller buckles go back to the Vikings, you know? So one of the other arguments we get in is about, oh, them horses were shod. And the other argument we get in, they made their own saddles and horse gear. Well, I just showed you where they got some horse gear in this case. They got it from a professional saddle maker in St. Louis who belonged to a craft and made a craft guild that made things a certain way. So just because it's old and beat up, don't mean it's period correct. But anyway, I wanted to put that in there just for my AMN buddy. Okay, and here's how he got paid. It says bills and notes, and I won't try to read this because I have a transcription of it. Drafts received by Campbell at the 1832 Rendezvous. Bills and notes. Okay, they're in on 25th. As agent for American Fur Company, Vanderpool drafted Pierre Choteau, agent for American Fur Company in St. Louis. In duplicate, $3,491.50. Rocky Mountain Fur gave him a draft on William Sublette, and it's payable on sale of beavers. Why did they do that? Because Sublette took their beaver back for it and sold them, charged the commission, so they knew he'd get the cash before they would, and he'd pay his own draft. And another draft for Rocky Mountain Fur for $50. That was some of those employees or relationships that were charging stuff to them. And then Fontenelle and Drips, who also had a relationship with American Fur on occasion, they wrote a draft for their purchase of $224. So there's $4,325.50, and that matches what the income was for all those individual rendezvous accounts. So, what is a draft? It's like a check, only it's different. It's what it is it's a promise. You draft it like he drafted it on Pierre Choteau. A draft usually comes with an invoice, and it says, whoever it's drafted on, if I have the money available from you, or if you owe me money in this amount, or you're my partner, or whatever you are, pay this man this amount on site. Most of the drafts they issued were site drafts. So as soon as they present that draft to Pierre Choteau, he gives them a check on his bank or a draft on his bank, and they go out and get the cash. So all this big time business, it was all done on paper. It was all done on paper. And the beauty of Robert Campbell's deal was when he left Rendezvous, he could put all this money in his saddlebag. He didn't have to load up a string of mules with fur and take care of a string of mules. That's why he was able to sell 9 of his horses to Vanderpool. And guess what those 9 horses did? They packed all these goods that Vanderpool, in other words, he sold the goods and the means to transport them all at one time. So this is about all the dull accounting stuff we're going to go through some real quick, just to see how much money he made, okay? Total revenue, we established that with all the drafts. That's what he paid the merchants. That's his gross profit. That's a gross profit margin of 65%. What's gross profit margin in business today? What do you think? When you buy something? 25, 30% if you're lucky. Anyway, that's pretty good. That's compared to today. Back in those days, I think it was pretty standard. But for rendezvous ventures, most of them would end up that way, I would think. Well, here's that ledger about one of the guys that worked for him, and I picked George Holmes because I liked his signature. Isn't that cool? And this guy over here, Anton Janis, he's witnessing George Holmes's signature, and what it says is, I paid you this much in wages at $14 a day from 20 March 1832 at $14 a day until, today. And that is, $61.70, it's less. He owes $58. Up here is what he owes, excuse me. This is the bottom of his ledger. There's a big ledger that goes up here, and all the charges he made, you can see he got 2 cups of flour for $2. So he owed $61.75. So the total of his wages from start to finish was $58. So he had to make him a present of $3.50 so it would balance. And there was only one guy of the 5 that worked for him. His name was Frizzer. Frizzer was the only guy that broke even. What he charged and what he owed was together. Everybody else, Campbell made a present of some money so they would balance. But just remember, he's selling these guys these goods along the road at Rendezvous prices. So that figure I put in there about his expenses is based on what he says he paid him, but it was far less than that. So I would say the net cash in his pocket is going to be a little more than what we're going to figure up here. Because you can see, I figured labor at $300. I bet it's only a third of that. Anyway, that was his expenses to get out there. Personal item shipping, the caravan cost, for shoeing horses and boarding them mainly before they left. Anyway, $746 in expenses goes against that gross profit. So he made $2,066.78. Plus, he only sold 9 horses, so he had about another 8 head left. He had those saddles and all that equipment, and he bought tents, he bought a teepee, he bought buffalo robes and cooking gear along the way. He had all that. That stuff valued about that much. So he had about a net profit of about $2,300, and that's real close to that $3,000 he was going to need to put up for them to go after American Pearl. So here's the little Hawking discussion. Here's the facts. You want the facts, man? Here's the facts. In his expense account, and this is how he titled, Expenses Attending the Mountain Equipment of Robert Campbell, 1832. He's got a March 28th entry, so very early before they even left. He paid Hawkins $30 for pits. And then, right after that, he paid Gordon Grimsley for 1 pair of holsters, $6. So he had $36 in a pair of pistols. And in his narrative, he said, when he's talking about the Battle of Puresole, we kept firing upon them. He's talking about the Blackfeet. So Bled and myself had a pair of flintlock pistols. So now we're saying, maybe these Hawking pistols are flintlocks, okay? And in the invoice of goods sold to O'Fallon in Vanderburg, which it should be Fallon in Vanderburg, in which it should only be Vanderburg because he paid for them, not O'Fallon, not Fallon. But anyway, 1 pair of pistols and holsters for $40. So, and here's an extra tidbit that makes it all even more interesting. Charles Hanson, Museum of Fur Trade founder, who's deceased now, and he wrote a book about the Hawking rifle. And in it, he also discussed Hawking pistols. Only 5 Hawking pistols are documented being sold from the years 1826 to 1840. Charlie went through all of the records of the Hawking shop once it went out of business, and the records are on file at St. Louis at the archives. And that's what he came up with. So that makes those Hawking pistols at the 1832 Rendezvous pretty rare. The Hawking shop records show original price of $16 each. The price per pistol eventually varied from $10 to $15. So what did Robert Campbell pay for his pistols? He never said how many, he just said pistol. $30. So that was probably 2 pistols. So I'll say, and it's not lead pipe cinch certain, but I am maintaining that we had flintlock pistols sold to Vandenberg and used at the fight of Puresole in 1832 Rendezvous. Now, one of my reviewers, Mark, all these articles are peer reviewed. They get sent to 3 reviewers. One of my reviewers said, well, what if Campbell already had pistols with him? And he sold the pistols he had with him to Vandenberg. And and kept the Hawkins. I said, doesn't matter, the Hawkins were still there at the Rendezvous. Doesn't matter if he had regular pistols. The only thing could mess up my theory is if the pistols he bought from Hawkins weren't ones they made. And as far as I know, they didn't broker other people's weapons. They might have rifles, but they didn't pistols. So it's one of those things in history that you say, well, I think we found something that's pretty neat, but I can't tell you it's 100% certain. But you artists, if you want to paint some Hawkins pistols in some artwork at Rendezvous in 32, I'd do it. They'd be Flint at the ones we know of. Oh, sorry. So, William Sublette, after being partners with Campbell till 1845 and doing quite well, they caused American fair grief, and that's a whole nother story we don't have time for today. But he died, so Campbell went on alone and invested his money wisely in and around St. Louis, and as St. Louis grew, he grew, and he made a lot of money, and he died in 1879, this poor Irish immigrant. And he died when the estate valued at $2 million in 1879. And there's a house that's now a museum. It's called the Campbell House in downtown St. Louis. I've been to it. I think it's, what, 6 stories? Isn't it 6 story? Do anybody remember? Do you remember, Jim? 3 story? God, it seems it's so tall, it's so narrow. It seems. But anyway, there's a great crew there. They archive a bunch of this information on Robert Campbell. And there's also the video that Alan McFarland did, and both the book and the video are for sale in the bookstore there. Anyway, it's a pretty amazing story from a guy that started out as a trapper and a clerk and a trap party leader. So that's all I have to say. If you've got any questions, I'd love to answer. Yes, sir. Right there. You had a question? Oh.
He could read and write. Is that the difference?
I can't hear you, Dave.
I said he could read and write. That's the difference?
Oh, yeah, that's in my paper, there's a little insert we did about fur trade clerks, and I described their duties and their requirements. And requirement number 1 is being able to read and write. But Campbell came with a bonus. He had knowledge of debits and credits, which he had learned when he worked for John O'Fallon. So, and not only that, just his nature. I talked in the paper, if you read the paper in the journal, I talked in there how he was one of the few guys that would take out a brigade of Iroquois trappers, predominantly Iroquois, the whole party. Iroquois trappers were very strong-willed and independent, but yet he would bring back as much for a more fur with his brigade of Iroquois trappers than the other guys with the regular crew, the regular veteran trappers, because he was that easy to get along with and knew how to work people. He's just one of those gifted people. Yes, sir.
So as I understand, basically all the trading was done on credit. So your goal was to basically either be even or be a little ahead at the end of the year.
Yep.
Because like carrying around cash in the mountains would probably just be extra weight.
Yeah, what are you gonna do with it? They did use cash, but you know where they used it? When they were on the way, like between St. Louis and the 200 miles it took to get to Lexington, they'd stop and buy little staples and bread from local ladies and have shirts made. So some of the guys would want to go to the local tavern. So they'd give them cash then, which was usually, French coin, gold or silver, something like that. And so they'd have something to spend at the tavern, but they'd write it against the ledger. That's the only time they didn't charge them a markup, is when they gave them cash. But that's how it worked. It was all on credit. Go ahead. You got
a little thing. There was a product in the beginning of the show called crab cider. What is that? And is it as disgusting as it sounds?
I think it's cider from crabapple trees.
Oh, okay.
I didn't look it up, but when I first read it, that's what I thought. Yes, sir.
We see Campbell and Sublette quitting the mountains at about the same time. Was that because you felt like they had made their money and we're now wanting to get into other businesses? Or did you find anything that kind of foresaw the end of the Rocky Mountain fur trade of the American West?
Well, if you remember, what happened in 1834? They made that infamous agreement with American Fur had enough of them. It just took 2 years, and American Fur had enough of them. American Fur made a 1-year agreement with them that they could have all of the rest of the Rocky Mountains other than the river forts, and that the American Fur would stay out of there for a year. And I think during that time, and they bought them out. They took over the debts of Thomas Fitzpatrick and Fontenelle. American Fur did this. And even when they sold to Pierre Choteau in 1834, same time, he took over those debts. In other words, Campbell and Sublette made one hell of a deal for exit stage left. So they worked it another year or so, and then they could see, I think they could see the handwriting on the wall, because there's a little book that they published every year. It was like information on the city of St. Louis. And there's some of those in archives, and I found one for like 1838. By then, it's already just Campbell and Sublette as individual merchants and traders. So they exited pretty quick. Right? I think they saw the handwriting on the wall and wanted to be merchants. They wanted to get out of the risk. They wanted to get away from that risk. Yeah, Bucky.
Yeah, on the men that he hired, they had to pay rendezvous prices. And you mentioned a gift, so he forgave the money they owed
Yeah,
when they got back?
he wrote, another, we'd call it today, he wrote it off.
Yeah,
That's how we would say.
okay. And basically, in the article, when I read it, the money was to be made supplying trappers, not movers so much. That's the kind of impression I got. That's where the money.
Well, the money was remade in supplying the goods. That's what Ashley figured out early on in the 1820s. But also, you want to remember, he brokered the fur for them. And Ashley did the same thing for Smith, Jackson, and Sublette. And they're charging those 7, 8, 10% fees. That $58,000 that he sold for Rocky Mountain fur, I'm sure he put anywhere from $4,000 to $5,000 of that in his pocket. So yes, that's where the cash was, in the business side. The guys out there trapping the fur, at best they had a good living if they liked to live that lifestyle.
So how much of the end of the beaver fur trade was because of the new fashion with the silk hats versus maybe just over harvesting the beaver?
You know, I think that's one of those where it's, from what I was, because I was just reading some stuff in another journal about Zenas Leonard's journal. He comes along. In fact, that Alfred Stevens was part of the group that Zenas Leonard was, and they came to the 1832. Their camp on the Laramie River, Alfred Stevens was, and he finds out that Gant Blackwell, he finds this out from Fitzpatrick, who was with Sublette and Campbell coming through, going to the Rendezvous. He finds out that Gant and Blackwell had shut their doors in St. Louis, and here's a trapping party in the mountains trying to trap for them, and they no longer have an employer. So that's how Alfred Stevens ends up at the Rendezvous, because they talked him into going along. So that part of the story, but the thing about the fur was, in Zenas Leonard's book, they talk about how it's harder and harder. Where they used to find lots of beaver, they found a lot less. And he would talk about where they used to get 40 packs of fur, they only got 20. And so I think that's part of it. And then the fashion change was the other part, because Ashley was buying beaver for $5 and selling it in St. Louis for $8. That was in 1825 to 1826. Well, you just saw what Sublette was able to get for good prime Rocky Mountain for $4.25 in 32. So there was a definite drop in price, and there was a lot of reasons for it, but the combination of fashion and the combination of beaver fur being harder to find, and that's when the robe trade picked up a lot of potential. But it was all kind of going on at the same time. Nutria coming in, but the robe trade had a big thing, and believe it or not, one of the most things they traded the most was plain old deer skins. Deer skins was probably by, as far as numbers of hides, there's more deer skins traded than beaver. Who did that? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I bet there is.
Most of the Hawkins that I've seen play are caps. And
Yeah,
if there were 5 documented pistols and 2 of these were flintlocks, do you think they were flintlocks or do you think they were cap pistols?
you know, I don't know, because if you go through the ledger, there's like 4 or 5 boxes of percussion caps that Campbell bought for somebody. But if they were for his pistol, I don't know. I can't tell because they're mixed in with all the other things he bought. So somebody had a percussion weapon. But he bought most of the rifles he bought a few from this merchant, bought some from Augustus Kerr. He bought some rifles there. He bought most of the stuff from Jonas and Augustus Kerr and some regular rifles there. Some of those could have been percussion. But yeah, I don't know how to tell the difference. All I can tell you is the facts are, he said he and Sublette used flintlock pistols, and he bought 2 pistols from Hawken and took them to the mountains. That's what I can tell you.
Clint?
Yes, sir. Hey, how you doing?
Fine. And you?
Oh, pretty good.
Perfect. I love it. I have a question though. It seems like we go to St. Louis and that's about the last we really hear of the beaver skins. Was it Astor who was then taking them from St. Louis to New York to put on his ships to go to Europe for the processing to making hats? Or are there other people involved in that?
There were some other people, but the primary one was Astor, because if you remember, there was a couple of times, especially the American Fur boys, the American Fur leaders in St. Louis would have to go back and meet with Astor and discuss, get a business plan as to what they were going to pay for fur and what it is. I mean, it was a business. So Astor was pulling the strings. And consequently, guys like Sublette and other people in the business, Hempstead and those guys, would go pay homage to Astor also, because he was the ultimate source in the end. There were some that went down the Mississippi to New Orleans to different brokers, but a bunch of it went east to Lord Astor. You bet.
Well, we're gonna switch gears here. We need to get the computers ready for the next talks, which will be at 3.